I want to kick off our next session with Trevor Hansen. Trevor is a partner solutions architect with AWS. He's been with us for about 3 years, and he's based in Seattle. So he's been around a long time. He has a lot of information to share, and he will be awesome at answering any of your questions. Without delay, I want to introduce Trevor, have him come up, and he can kick off launching your application the Amazon way. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Testing, testing, testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Hi, everyone. Great. So I sorted out the aircon issue, so now we can start talking about some cool things. So I'm Trevor Hansen. I'm a partner solution architect with Amazon Web Services. And over the last 3 years, I've been pretty much in, I think, 6 different roles. And all of them have been touching from startups through to enterprise and focused on the DevOps and automation space. So I had the privilege of actually being in the support organization, going into startups, and then going through to enterprises that are starting to adopt these transitions. And a lot of this required me to actually be involved with discussions with the service teams that are also going through that transition, being able to be a lot more agile and a lot more focused. So my goal today is kind of go over a bit of what is DevOps and how we started transitioning this internally at Amazon and how we started seeing the benefits throughout that process. But then if the Wi-Fi permits, I've got a bit of a demo that I'm actually going to show you guys how to get some hands-on and show you actually what it looks like in the console. So, live demos are always exciting, and hopefully it all goes well. So if you guys join me, and hopefully you learn something. So just to get some things out of the way, if you guys have any questions, let's leave it at the end so that we can really, I can, have, this time to cover all these topics, because I've got quite a bit of areas I'd like to cover with you guys. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer it, and you guys are more than welcome to come to me afterwards, and I'll be glad to answer any additional questions. DevOps is pretty much what I live and breathe, so I've seen it all. I've seen the bad and the good, and I've seen the transitions. So if there's any opportunity for me to help you guys with any information, I'm here. So to get things started, so I'm going to give, if you guys, just a quick show of hands, who understands what DevOps is? Great, so I don't need to be here. I'm joking. So who's actually using DevOps on a day-to-day basis, or has these applied in their organizations, on their developments? Show of hands. Excellent. So there is some usage, and I'm sure the first couple of slides is going to must probably be a lot of the content you're already aware of, but let's hopefully provide some extra context there. So the next aspect is how did we go through that transition through the DevOps process? How did we go from this monolithic application concept through to a very microservices concept at a really big company such as Amazon, with some sun shining in my eyes? And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to dive over some of the development tools that we have that you can use from day one as a startup to actually be competitive against those enterprise companies, right? Like now with the equal playing field and these services that are available, I can quickly show you guys a couple of examples on how you can actually achieve this. I'm going to stand this side because the sun's shining there. So as you guys know, at the moment, in order for you to remain competitive, your software has to be moving really quickly, right? And look back 10 years ago, software, you would have to email out a CD or post a CD out to a company, and then the tech dude would have to go around to all the computers and do the patching and updating, and the poor guy must probably, struggled with pain, and I was that poor guy. So I know how bad it gets, and especially when you start dealing with big applications where companies are dependent on those, the pressure's on immediately, right? And there's a lot more risk involved, and you're doing these really big updates that could really break things and bring the company down for a period of time. And now when you start moving towards the applications that you have on your phones and what companies use, in the front end, we're only seeing 5% of that change happening because we see visual differences, new features, icons, things populating on the front end. But on the back end, that company, such as, you guys can all think of good company names, on the back end, they're releasing thousands of lines of code into production daily because they're continuously enhancing that experience, right? So if they're running like a marketing campaign, or they're starting to deliver software in some capacity as a service, they want every single user to have that same experience on the back end, right? And they also want to be able to iterate really quickly and being able to hit that market and really start going really quickly. And your tools that empower your developers to be able to work faster is critical to remain competitive and be able to work fast, right? And as you can see now with startup companies that come in, they're using these lean, agile, module concepts, they're able to start competing against these big companies that have been nurturing these big monolithic applications. And now they have to go and they start a new whole startup thing on the side, or they buy a startup. But at the end of the day, once you start moving away from this whole burden of developing and trying to maintain this big architecture concept and moving towards a DevOps model, as you guys are all aware, the benefits start showing, right? So when we actually started looking into the benefits, there was actually a study done. It was Puppet Labs. And this is the numbers that really show, right? This is where you can start seeing that you can actually, release code a lot more frequently. And what that actually means is, at the end of the day, it's a quicker turnaround time towards your customers, right? There's feedbacks that are coming back from your customers, the operations and the business development. They're requesting certain things. There's certain functionalities that you guys want to be able to get back to quickly, right? Those are all the great parts, but what happens when you start, a customer reports an issue and multiple people have an issue, right? How do you fail back really quickly? How do you implement a bug that you can, a patchwork that you can send out really quickly, and being able to have automation in place to do that at scale, okay? So now we've been talking about a lot of how the startup world is adopting these, but what happens if your startup gets some serious backing and 5 years down the line you're the Airbnb or you're the Netflix or whatever the case is, right? If you've adopted these models now and being able to scale that out, that can really become a massive benefit for you guys to become an agile enterprise, like being able to move really quickly. This is why internally at Amazon and launching AWS services, they're all applying these models internally, because we're able to continuously iterate. Every time a customer asks for something, there's a process that we can quickly start following with these developers, can start pushing that code out into production to make it easier for our customers to be able to use those services on a day-to-day. So, and as I mentioned, the recovery time, right? Recovery is most probably the biggest pain. There's nothing worse than sitting there over a period of hours trying to figure out where in your monolithic application, down dependency trees, you start seeing these failures, right? And when you start putting in a DevOps model, and I'm going to show you guys in a couple of slides on, you can actually implement, the testing and the staging, and being able to implement a lot of automation to be able to mitigate those pain points before even it gets to the customer, right? And not having to go and hire someone to do that, but having software to be able to do that for you. Once you've got the model working, the process and the pipeline working, you can actually start pushing the code on the one side, and you're confident that when it gets out on the other side, it's gone through a lot of testing and scrutiny, and if your company requires compliance, if it requires any additional testing, whatever it is, you want to put that in before that code hits production, right? So now let's take a step back and let's look at DevOps, right? And this could be a whole workshop across a couple of weeks, because every single company has their own way of doing this, right? Because DevOps is, the developers and operation coming together, but in AWS and Amazon, there's three crucial aspects that we focus on, right? And this is where there's a cultural change that happens in a company, right? This is where, and I'll be diving into those things shortly, it's a massive culture change, because when a company starts adopting a DevOps model, they're a software-orientated company. And in the startup world, we're seeing that, if you're not a software company nowadays, if you're not having software driving your business, how do you remain competitive? Like if somebody was asking me the other day, how do I start using cloud computing services in a 50-year-old company already? They are hardcore on infrastructure, right? And the first question asked is, do you have a technical person sitting in your meetings, like in decision-making meetings? Is your architecture and your infrastructure supporting your company to drive and become more competitive, right? And a fair portion of that company is on a day-to-day basis just using their technology to get their job done. But is that going to keep them around for the next 50 years? I don't know. Hopefully we're all around to be able to answer that question with that company, right? And the last thing is, developers, this is the exciting time for anyone that has some form of understanding and development, right? If you've got a programming language, you have some skills. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to develop applications. I mean, you have so many businesses that are building beautiful APIs out there that do all that heavy lifting for you, and empowering the developers with more tools. And I mean, AWS, being a company that I've been working for 3 years, is the more you empower developers with tools to get their job done, to make it a lot more customer-centric and give them that whole feedback loop from producing code, going through testing, seeing it go into production, and actually getting that feedback, seeing what monitoring aspects it provided for their customers, and continuously improving that cycle, right? So tooling becomes a crucial aspect of that. So the culture, as I mentioned, is no longer having these two different silos. And the two different silos we see in previous companies is you have your development team that usually is maybe outsourced. If you're in a startup realm, you've got developers that are sitting overseas, and what they're doing is they're producing code and they're shipping it to you, and then you're sitting there with the operations team that are trying to build out the infrastructure. They're trying to put the code. Now you have to have the development team continuously sit there, and there's long-winded calls, there's emails, there's processes that just make it really hard. And what DevOps did is broke that wall down completely, and you put the responsibility in the developer's hands, right? You take that infrastructure aspect and the production aspect, and you give the developer the power to be able to control that in his hands, right? There's no better way than getting a developer to really see the long-term benefits in his production and his code for his customers. They get to see that whole life cycle, and they can really see how it is on a fine-grained axis, right? And as I mentioned, it's the ownership, right? As soon as you start having more ownership, you become a lot more passionate about it. If you had to, in a DevOps model, especially in our company, what I've realized is when somebody is proposing a new service internally and they're going through that process, I'll be talking about it, the 2P to team concept is these guys are so passionate about their particular area. And the thing is now giving them these DevOps operations and processes in place that they can manage. They have a lot more control on how to iterate and continuously improve on that service, being able to fix those bugs and get it out to our customers a lot quicker. So, and I mentioned visibility, right? Visibility, the more you start scaling in any software application or DevOps model, monitoring and visibility on every single layer becomes even more crucial, right? To understand how long did a build process take? How long did it take for that application to deploy onto infrastructure? How long was that response time in comparison to the previous version for a customer? Being able to have those things in place can really help you understand, are you moving in the right direction or you're just trying to solve problems the whole time, right? So at Amazon, the first thing we did is essentially we broke, we looked at I think there's a slide further on in this one, but we moved away from this monolithic application that we had hundreds of developers all working on the same thing, right? And try get someone into new hire training. You employ someone, anyone who was on the previous talk on the other side, I think you were mentioning to me about, how do you start employing more people when you start scaling out a startup? Imagine starting to build out a monolithic application and, if you see any developments, documentation is usually maybe not the best side of development because you have to get really quickly. You're starting to get backing. The technical guys is usually 2 or 3 guys that have been carrying the weight for a couple of years. It's all sitting in there, right? No one understands what's going on, and you try get that guy's time for a minute and get him to explain this monolithic application to you, right? Different psychology is when you start breaking things up and you're decoupling it and you make them their own little dependencies. When you employ someone and he's, let's say, a Python developer or he's, he does Node.js, you know that this guy is maybe very focused on APIs. So you know that he'll be focusing on a very specific area in a team where he can contribute from day one and start working with that team. He can actually start applying his values immediately to that team. He just needs to understand the concepts of what they do, who are their customers internally, and what they're trying to achieve. They can have the release processes, their bugs, their feature requests, and immediately this guy can start contributing, right? Because now he doesn't have to understand all the things. He just needs to understand what their team is responsible for. It ties into ownership, right? So this is the thing that really DevOps, and I mean, a lot of you put up your hand on DevOps, and you understand that going through continuous integration and continuous deployment delivery, this is something that really empowers this journey, right? Is being able to, there was a couple of slides back about how fast, that at 60x being able to develop and release code faster. This process with a fair portion of automation in place can make you achieve that, right? Is how do you have source control of your code that can scale out to hundreds of developers, right? What happens if you become that? We use Netflix as an example at AWS quite frequently, but imagine internally how their development teams, when they started employing hundreds of developers to start contributing, source control becomes, and versioning control, and being able to have, teams being able to contribute on the source side, that becomes a massive pain point. And fortunately, we've got a couple of services. We've also got some partner companies that have provided, really cool software out there that can make, version control quite an easy thing for you to do. And I'm excited in the demo. Yes, time's still good. In the demo, I'm actually going to show you guys Cloud9, which is our tool that it's an IDE that's based cloud-based, right? So we also have the build aspect, so actually taking that code once you've committed a change, being able to actually stand it up. So if anyone has actually done some developments and code deployments, code pipeline, etc., you've gone through the process potentially of having a Jenkins box or some form of testing against that code, right? The last thing you want is commit or push to production, right? So we all know those memes. Anyway, so, and then obviously at the end, production. There's another aspect on the end of that, which is monitoring, but we'll get onto that. So the first big transition that we saw was moving away from, as I mentioned, developers doing code and your infrastructure and your operations and your system admin guys having to go and provision resources and being able to have, that whole provision request process, saying, I need this particular Linux box and I need all these dependencies installed. And, there is a lot of pain points, right? Especially when it comes around to security and so on, right? But now when you start being able to iterate and starting to break things up into a decoupled process, infrastructure as code becomes extremely important. And we have obviously a service cloud formation. We also have some partner companies that have orchestration tools and things in place that make it a lot easier for you. But a lot of the services that you'll see internally that I'll be showing you now in the demo actually uses CloudFormation to go build out these replicable templates, right? So you can have a CloudFormation template that provides, you have a whole bunch of parameters, and essentially you're proposing what resources you'd like to create, and those properties can tie into that parameter base, and essentially you can create that CloudFormation template with an API call. By providing those parameters, straight away now you have something that can be replicated no matter how many times you're running that API call, right? And this allows you to really have a solid version control process on your infrastructure. You can actually take your infrastructure templates, infrastructure as code, put it into GitHub and have a controlled or version control across that, right? So that became a really big change, is moving towards infrastructure as code and empowering developers to actually understand how the application runs on that template. So I've covered a fair portion of the monitoring, and I think this is a whole discussion on its own. Monitoring is something that is not just no longer a resource utilization, but when you start doing build testing, when you start doing analyzing, when you start doing log diving, you can start using that data to empower you, right? When you start taking logs, you can actually use those things to be able to automate different things in place. When you start taking anything that comes out of an application, if you put some logic around that, you can continue to improve the performance of that application. So understand where things are starting to go better, where things are starting to go less. I did a webinar the other day where a company that, fairly DevOps orientated, they're a fairly large company, they decided to apply a new monitoring tool to their existing 5 different internal tools that their development teams have been working on and building internally. Immediately once they did a data collection, they're able to save $600,000 just on monitoring resource utilization across their whole AWS accounts. That is just resources that were not utilized correctly. So they're able to be able to save by reducing resource utilization. That doesn't even talk about the turnaround time on the DevOps. So DevOps on AWS, and I think I don't want to dive too much more on the presentation side because I really want to get to a demo. But as I mentioned, infrastructure as code becomes a really powerful thing. We have CloudFormation for that, right? Microservices, we have a couple of different aspects. You can really use things such as Lambda, which you can run just your code and being able to invoke it, and based on a fair portion of different invoking endpoints. So you can have things anywhere from an API call to having integrated things like SQS, SNS, even Alexa skills. Like if you guys have ever looked at Alexa skills, it's a really cool thing because Lambda is a really powerful tool, and if you start tying it into things with, let's say, step functions, you can really start creating really powerful, scalable microservices aspects. We also have, containers, and I think if anyone uses containers in any capacity, okay, cool. So I don't have to give you the whole pitch about, the power of containers, right? But containers essentially allows you to reduce that blast radius and really separates the operation of the operating system and let your code run within that container. And that becomes extremely powerful in the microservices aspect because you can scale that out without having to worry about And this is where monitoring ties in, right? Monitoring, I've explained this. Continuous integration, we've ran over that. So I've kind of tied this into every slide that I've been speaking to. So I think I'll wrap this up at the end of the presentation, given time. So at Amazon, we obviously, as I mentioned, in 2001, when we first analyzed our thing, we had a large amount of our applications at Amazon was building out the business as it scales, the applications were scaling with it in a monolithic way, right? They were really becoming these massive moving machines, like imagine a ship continuously having to reinvent itself on the move. It became extremely dangerous, and there was a lot of pain points. And I think, truthfully, you saw this in AWS. If you guys have been using AWS in the very beginning stages, there was a lot of pain points that we had to get around, right? And when starting to move towards the decoupled service and being able to break things apart and reduce the blast radius. If one thing breaks, we could have automation and logic in place to say that if that dependency is no longer there, if it's not responding in the way it is, I can potentially do something else. And we saw that, I think if you've seen any of our presentations about the two-pizza team, we realized that a microservice would usually be the best fit of having about a two-pizza team. So, I mean, if you come from different countries, two different pizzas is different sizes and the amounts of developers you have. I mean, I may be a skinny guy, but I think I could finish 2 pizzas on my own if on a good day. But, at the end of the day, 2 pizza teams is what we saw is really good, right? When you start getting above that, it just becomes a lot more, a lot more broken up. And I think the ownership and the collaboration is an essential aspect, right? So if you've got a lot of people working on the same portion of code, there's a lot of different mindsets, and there's a lot of different, people steering in different ways about how to achieve things. When you have smaller teams, you can have really, teamwork start showing effectiveness. And I think if you've ever done development with a couple of people on the same project, when you have too many chefs in the kitchen, it becomes a bit of a, mess, right? So in 2009, we essentially ran a study to see, after we've moved from this monolithical towards a microservices and a decoupled approach, we decided to see, being all proud about, the transition and seeing how things are going, we wanted to understand how things were really performing on the back end, right? And this is when we realized that when you start looking at an enterprise company and you've got a lot of customers out there that are dependent on you, you start seeing that even if you have all these things in place, we realized that there was a lot of wait time between different aspects, right? So developers would be all proud, they've got their code, they're happy it's working. Now they want to push it to the next stage. There's a ticket, or there's a process, or there's an email, there's a person you need to contact, and usually that adds additional delays, right? And then the security team maybe has to review it. Then you have people that have to build this up and be able to do some testing against it. Most of the times there'll be problems that will come through that pipeline, and it would have to go all the way back to the developers, and guess what? That guy's to start that process potentially again, right? And that eventually to get production, to be able to put code out there to actually solve real-world problems for customers, or to give them an experience as a startup what you want to achieve, that pain point becomes even more of a delay if you're dealing with a cross-team collaboration, right? So when you look at that, you see it's not hours, it's potentially days. If you've ever had to deal with a company where you have different teams that you have to work with from development to production, that is not a couple of minutes deployment or an hour deployment, right? And we'll be actually testing it shortly with one of our services on how from a code change to actually code in production that's gone through a whole testing and building pipeline, that could be a couple of minutes, if not less. So originally what we did is we decided to solve this problem to put tools in place that make life easier for us, like being able to automate things as much as possible, right? If you can get something to replace a job and do it really well, not trying to take on the whole world or trying to solve all the world's problems, but just focus on a very particular area to get something done right. And this is where a lot of internal teams started working towards developing these tools, which essentially related into turning into our services, right? I think in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, yes, 2015, I think we recorded 50 million code pushes to production across that year. That is only possible by adapting towards the new CI/DC platform concept and being able to have automation in place to do a lot of that heavy lifting throughout that. So now you can have all these teams that are 2 pizza teams to be able to really every single day push code to production. It seems scary, But if you have the right processes in place, that automation can really avoid any pain points before it even gets to production. So the next question is, if I haven't started, where do I start, right? This is something that I cannot answer in the time period I have. This is something that I would have to potentially sit with you, every single one of you individually, to help you achieve this in a company that you're currently working at, right? But there's a lot of entry points that I think we'll be able to cover now shortly. So in AWS, there's a couple of services on the coding side that I'll be running over in the demo with you guys. And our time still looks good. But code commits. So code commits is essentially our Git version control repository where you can have your code storing inside there. You can really branch out. And if you guys, anyone worked with Git, you understand what it is, right? But the amazing part about this is it integrates to all our AWS services that essentially tie into the code aspect. And in our demo, I'll actually show you how that works out. AWS CodeBuild is a really cool service because you can actually, the first time we launch it now, it'll take about a minute for it to launch. But then after that, it actually does that build test, and you can actually have all the details about how long it took to stood up. You can actually have testing and integrating implied into that. And we have a fair portion of third-party tooling that you can actually apply into your code build to be able to do additional testing. You can actually hold it at particular points throughout that pipeline to be able to do manual testing if that's required. So AWS CodeDeploy, it's matured like crazy, and I'm actually really proud to see how it's evolved. But this really allows you to deploy that code down onto the instances if you're using EC2 in some capacity, or even on-prem, right? But then code pipeline is I'm going to have to show you in the demo, because when you start looking into the breakdown, you actually see, as I mentioned, you go through the source, the build, the testing is the third-party integrations that I was talking about. And every single application that you guys are working on, testing is a different experience, right? You guys, if you've ever done a testing, looking to testing, there's so many different theories, from the how much automation all the way down to hundreds of people testing it for you. So testing is a very unique thing, especially if your company you got your own proprietary software that you're proud about, and this is how you guys make money, right? So in order for you to test to make sure your application is working properly, this is something that I recommend to highly customize to make sure that you're testing to make sure you're moving in the right direction. And then CodeDeploy, as I mentioned, pushing things down onto thing. And this is where you can push down to EC2, you can push to Lambda, and you can push obviously onto on-prem. So Code Pipeline essentially manages that whole orchestration process for you, right? And this allows you to be able to set up those different stages and to define what happens at those different stages. So this is something that I want to get into the thing. So if you've never really played with AWS services, or you've never really been in a continuous integration to continuous deployment, never really played with DevOps, being able to implement all of this from the get-go could be slightly intimidating, right? And if you've ever played with, I think, if anyone worked with Elastic Beanstalk? Okay, cool. So the idea with Elastic Beanstalk was AWS, we were preaching, the whole three-tier web application concept, but, a lot of people were doing it in lots of different ways. So we decided to create Elastic Beanstalk that helps build out the three-tier web application for you and help with that continuously deploying code down onto those instances. So we build the load balancer, we build the auto-scaling group for the web tier, and we have the worker tier that you can scale out, right? So it's based on the three-tier highly available web application. CodeStar essentially goes and takes all these code CI/DC platform tools, and it makes it into a package for you that you can pretty much, from the get-go, in a couple of minutes, take some code from GitHub or your code that you have and push it into this. We go provision all these things I was talking about now for you, not underneath a hood that you cannot see. You still have access to all of it, but you can slowly but surely move into understanding each of those components. And this is something that could be from day one, or it could be something over a period of time. And the best part about it is this can be applied as a startup with one developer, or it could be adopted by a company that has hundreds of developers contributing to an application. So AWS Cloud9, if anyone has watched recent announcements or any talks or anything like that, we've obviously released our IDE, which is a cloud-based IDE. It allows you to basically have your IDE in the browser, and this allows you to have real-time collaboration on code and be able to integrate into AWS services. You have GitHub integration, and this is what I'll be showing you in the demo. How's my time looking? Okay, so demo time. So I actually want to go onto my own laptop, so let's see how this goes. Excellent. So I hope I'm keeping you guys all awake because this day's been fairly long, and I'm sure there's a lot of information that's been coming your way. But I thought, I tried to get through that fairly quickly, so sorry if it was really quick. And the accent's from South Africa, by the way, so if you guys don't know where I'm from South Africa. So if you go to the console, AWS CodeStar, this is basically where you start. And the time is 15:15. So at the moment, you can pretty much go to the console, and on the left-hand side, you'll be able to predefine, what you want to be searching for. And today, I think what I'm going to do is I just want to give you guys an example on a web application, and I'm going to be working on a Node.js application, and you can pretty define, because this at the moment is collecting what is it going to look like for you guys, right? And you have different requirements. So you can either, as I mentioned, push out to Elastic Beanstalk. So you can have this whole continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline tie into Elastic Beanstalk, which is a highly available application. Sounds like a lot, right? But within 10 minutes, you could pretty much have code from GitHub and have it running on this whole beautiful architecture in 10 minutes on AWS. So without further talking, I'm going to put it on AWS Lambda, and I'm going to select it. So the cool part is GitHub, one of our partners, Amazon Partner Network partners, they've actually also provided some integration into that. So you can actually choose to actually put your code on GitHub. And this requires obviously just connecting your account to GitHub. But as I mentioned, AWS, we have code commits, which is our version control repository. So all you need to really do is provide your own project name, which this you can actually lock down via IAM. So if you have hundreds of teams, or I all wish that you guys startups super succeed, and I'll be glad to help you throughout any questions that you have throughout that process. But the goal is to really apply security at every layer. So you want to actually be able to say that this is going to be Trevor for CEO, okay? Yeah, it looks good. And I'm going to put it on code commit. So what this is actually going to do, it's going to tell you that it's going to provide you the source location with your code commit. It's going to actually go and provide the build and the testing. It's going to be built out by CodeBuild. So you don't actually have to go predefine anything. It's going to go create this in your account for you. The next aspect is, in order to do the deployment aspect of Lambda, CloudFormation actually goes and does that build testing for you. The beautiful part about this is if there's any issues around that build process, CloudFormation rolls back to the previous good known state. And this is really powerful because the CloudFormation team actually integrates into the other services and the APIs. And if there's ever errors or anything like that, they can actually on the back end be able to start rolling that stack back. And the nice part about this whole process is CloudFormation supports a thing called change sets. So before you even propose a change to the code on CloudFormation, you can produce a change set to tell you what changes actually happen on a resource level. It tells you that a resource gets replaced or this resource gets modified, and you can actually add a step in this whole pipeline to say that if there's going to be a resource replacement maybe, you can actually put a step there that has to be a manual click by the CEO. There's a lot of beautiful, interesting stories that I've heard, but there are options that you can put in place. So the next aspect is how do you integrate? Where do you start contributing to that code, right? And I was keen to go through console, but I'm not going to give you guys the hard thing about trying to squeeze your eyes to look at the console. I decided to show you Cloud9. So pretty much this is going to actually go build a Cloud9 instance for us in my account. It's going to provide me access to it so I can actually go and see my code. And right now they provide sample applications for this launch, so I'm just going to use that for now. So for my testing, I'm going to just go for an M3. Obviously, not being a very startup authentic, saving costs, but just for testing purposes. Another thing is you obviously don't want that to be running all the time, right? So you can actually set it to go downtime. And just for now, I'm going to set it for a day. Okay, so right now what this is actually doing is it's just taken that little bit of information I provided, which was the name and pretty much what my code is going to be, where it's going to be sitting, it's going to be, and where I want to publish it to, right? So if you go and check in the console, you actually have your little tabs on the left-hand side, and you'll see this will actually start. It's busy building out all those resources for us. This is a sample application that's sitting over there at the moment. It's going to be using this code and pushing it out to that Lambda, right? So while that's busy building, I want to talk about teams, right? So you can actually have IAM users. If any of you use AWS, I highly encourage not to use root users, and you just, I hope you all got IAM users and you're tying it really locked down with policies, and you're not just giving people root access. I mean, this is quite fundamental 101. But for the purpose of this, I'm just going to choose my application. So if you have a new person stepping in and you want them to start contributing this on day one, you can pretty much go and add this in there. And much like everything else, API driven, so you can go and create that user via API and you can tie them into this. Or you can put them in a group that already has permissions to be able to tie into this. So there's a lot of really cool ways that you could achieve that. So I'm going to add myself to this. And as you can see, OK, let's go and change it because I actually want to be a contributor. OK, so that's all good. OK, so as you can see, CodeStar is already started. If we go and check it on the side. So as I mentioned, you've got the code pipeline, right? Code pipeline, we can actually go check it on this side over here. This is the different stages. And as I mentioned, you got your code, you got your build, you got your testing, you got push to production. And that is what we, out of the box, provide. But you can actually go and take a look at it and control it on a very top level. So you can actually see that my source is actually sitting in code commit. My build is currently being run by AWS CodeBuild. The deployments is creating that change set, the change sets I was telling you guys about. And then the essential deployments is executing that change set, so actually pushing that code into Lambda. And if you actually go look at that in CloudFormation, we can actually go and look. As I mentioned, you still have access to all of those resources. You'll see that this is actually going to build out those aspects. And if you go check this over here, resources, it's gone and built out all those rules and policies and things for you, right? And you can still go and modify those things additionally. So you can actually go and see now, this is busy creating for the first time, so you can see that the source application was set up correctly. The source code has been committed. It's currently going through the build process, so actually building that instance that I can use for build testing. And then the last aspect is actually deploying that code down to Lambda. So the next aspect is, I actually want to show you something. Yeah, so on the build side, you can actually, you'll see that when I push a change, you can actually go and see build history. So as I mentioned, the first time you build it, because the instance has to spin up and do that first initial build test of my code, it's going to be about a minute, and I've gauged it about a minute to about 2 minutes, depending on your application. But once this instance is actually up and running, and you have your teams contributing, they come in and work on the Monday morning, they have 10 different issues that they need to be dealing with, they can start doing their production, pushing code, and that pretty much every change would go through that build test. 20, 30 seconds is what I've been testing, but as I mentioned, every application handles differently, especially if you have dependencies in play. So you can also go and put Jenkins integration. If any of you guys are familiar with Jenkins, this becomes pretty much the documentation's all there. And while we're in the documentation, I have to stress that we try our best to provide documentation around all of our services. And if anything is unclear, you're welcome to reach out to me, or if you guys have support, reach out to support, and encourage them to provide clarity at a particular area, and they'll provide you with all the necessary details in that area. So if you guys are on any of the startup programs, or if you guys have support in any capacity, I highly encourage leverage them as much as possible. Not just from a support, things are broken, they're not working, but actually, please help me understand how I can achieve this. Please explain to me where I can find these necessary things. How can I use this service and integrate it with other services? Use support as an addition to your team. Allow them to provide you with that useful information. And I encourage you to test it more frequently, because a lot of companies I've seen at enterprise scale, they even see this as a benefit, even if they've got highly skilled developers on a day-to-day basis. This growing services offering that we have, and 125 services and growing, I think, it becomes a lot more complex because each of those services are becoming mature on their own. Okay, so let's quickly go and check to see how things are going. So as you can see now, because obviously it's building out these resources for the first time, we're pretty much in the last leg of it going through that deployment. Okay, so I think the Cloud9 environment's up and running. Let's see if it's up. Yes, it is. So Cloud9, the really cool part about Cloud9 is this is put on top of an EC2 instance for you. It means that you straight away have console access into that instance. So if you go and check, there it's actually going through that first provision build space. And this is my test application that you can see over here. It's been put on that instance for me. I just need to go and actually provision this instance on that aspect, right? So I can actually go and see, things are actually there, right? So I've gone and put a couple of code things in there. So I just need to configure that user, the one that I put in the permissions area to give me access. Okay, that looks good. So see, so there's my application, right? If you're not a console-driven person and you're still, early stage of understanding how to use these things, you can actually go and take a look at this manually yourself by just actually click on it, and it opens up for you in the console where you can go and do that, right? The nice part about this is GitHub is integrated immediately into this. So you can actually version control, you can work on this code day to day, and you continuously commit, and it ties into all the things that we spoke about earlier. So let's see where we are on this dashboard. Okay, so deployment successful. So this Lambda function has now obviously been given a DNS entry in Route 53, and by hitting that DNS endpoint, there's my Lambda function. It's given me some code back from Node.js, and this is what it's pretty much splashed out for me, right? I can actually go back and I can go see invocation counts. I think give CloudWatch metrics a tiny bit of time. You can actually go check that Lambda function yourself, but for the purpose of testing, let's go to, okay, let's go and test this. So what I want to do is, I'm in the right location. Let's change something very basic. File, save. So what I want to do is basically see if I can check that in, given the time period that I have left. So if anyone hasn't worked with Git in some capacity, and I'm hoping you have, I highly encourage it. Let's see if we can push these changes. Okay, so what I've just done is I went and changed it from congratulations to congratulations, Trevor. And what this is going to do is if the console is actually sticking with me, let's go and see. Okay, so you can see code commits has accepted my change, so it's in code commits. And as you can think, because we've built all the automation around it, the source has noticed that there's been a recent change to the code, and guess what's going to happen? It's going to go and take that code, it's going to go do the whole build test process on it. Given that I haven't put any issues in my code and the application checks out, there's no errors and things like that, what's going to happen is it's going to do that build test. We can actually go and check to see how that build is performing. Let's give it some time. Okay, so still busy going. Yeah, so what you can essentially see is it will go do that build test, and based on the completion, because we haven't put any checkpoints to halt, and as I mentioned, sometimes you have development teams that are dealing with compliance applications, and you maybe have to have a security reviewer to go and do the last click, right? And you can do that by just going straight into, into the pipeline, and we can actually go and say edit, and just before the deployments, after build, we want to go to add a stage. We want to say last man alive. And it may be as approval process. And you can predefine what it is. And there's a lot of fine-grained components, right? Or you want to do additional testing, or you want to do additional build aspects. You have flexibility in defining what happens throughout that pipeline. So let's see how things are going. Let's not change that now. I hope this has been useful for you guys and learned something. Let's go see. CodeStar. Okay, so it's busy doing the build test at the moment, so let's see if CodeBuild. Do I have CodeBuild open? No, I don't. Okay, as you can see, my code, the build change took 25 seconds on the back end, so it actually went and took that code, it stood it up on CodeBuild, it did its testing, it made sure that the 200 response, and I'm guessing that's all I need at the moment, and my time is up, and let's see if that code went to production. So what that's going to do now is going to take that code, it's going to push it into CloudFormation, it's going to do the application change, and what's going to happen is that CloudFormation template is going to push the change to Lambda, and once that change has happened, I could pretty much go and hit that console, and it should give me the new code. But given my time is up, as you can imagine, because I just changed one thing, it's going to be there. But yeah, change from a previous, really long-winded deployment process to having something like this out of the box. I highly encourage play with it. If you have any questions, you can come speak to me later. Reach out to me through LinkedIn. You should be able to find me. I'm Trevor Hansen. So thanks a lot for coming through today, guys, and I hope you have a wonderful day further.